Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, dressed as ordinary moments, a spilled drink, a wrong turn, a door you shouldn't have opened. Mine arrived on a Tuesday night, carrying a tray of champagne flutes and wearing shoes that pinched my left heel raw. I had been working at Alara for 7 months by then. 7 months of polished marble floors that reflected everything except the people who cleaned them. 7 months of starched white shirts, of memorizing which fork went where, of learning to move through a room full of wealth without disturbing the air around it. The kind of invisible that only working people understand. Present enough to serve, forgettable enough to never be truly seen. The event that Tuesday was a private dinner. The kind where the guest list didn't exist in any system I had access to. Where the head manager, Mr. Calloway, walked the floor 3 times before service began, adjusting centerpieces that didn't need adjusting. I noticed the extra security before anything else. 2 men stationed near the private entrance, both in dark suits that fit too well to be decorative. One of them had an earpiece. The other kept his hands folded in front of him like a man who had learned to look patient while remaining entirely alert. Harper. My coworker Destiny appeared beside me near the service corridor, her voice low. Table 9 is the one tonight. Don't make eye contact. Don't linger. Don't ask if they need anything unless they signal. Just pour and disappear. Who is it? She gave me the look she reserved for questions she considered dangerous. Someone important. That's all you need. I nodded and adjusted the tray against my palm. The champagne flutes caught the warm overhead light and threw small gold reflections across the ceiling. I had learned to carry things steadily no matter what was happening beneath the surface. A useful skill, in this job and in life. Table 9 sat in the far corner of the private dining room, partially screened by an arrangement of tall white orchids and frosted glass panels. 4 men occupied the surrounding chairs, all of them speaking in voices too low to carry. But it was the figure at the center of the table that pulled my attention the moment I crossed the threshold. Not because he demanded it, not because he was loud or obvious, but because of the exact opposite. He was still. In a room full of movement, waitstaff circling, conversation murmuring, ice shifting in crystal glasses, he sat without restlessness, without performance. His black suit jacket was immaculate, structured across the shoulders with the kind of tailoring that didn't come from any store I'd ever walked into. The white shirt beneath it was open at the collar, and even from across the room I could see the dark edge of ink rising from his chest toward his throat, tattoos that disappeared beneath his jaw like a story told in fragments. His hair was dark and swept back from a face that was almost unfairly structured. Sharp jaw, heavy brow, eyes that were currently fixed on the man speaking across from him with an expression I could only describe as controlled patience. He looked young. That was the thing that surprised me most. Not older than 30, maybe, but carrying something in his posture that had nothing to do with age. A kind of settled certainty. Like a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. I moved to the adjacent table first, refilling glasses for a couple seated near the window, keeping my movements smooth and unhurried the way Calloway had trained us. I was good at this. I was good at taking up very little space. Then I approached table 9. The 4 surrounding men barely registered my presence. One of them shifted his chair slightly to give me access. I moved to the far side of the table first, pouring carefully, keeping my eyes on the glass, and not on the man at the center. My coworker's warning was unnecessary. I had no intention of drawing attention to myself. That was the whole point of this job, of most of my life, honestly. Don't be seen. Don't become a problem. Pour and disappear. I was nearly finished when it happened. One of the men at the table shifted suddenly. Stood, actually, rising half out of his chair to lean toward the man beside him with something urgent to say. His elbow caught the edge of my tray. It wasn't a dramatic collision. It was barely a touch. But the tray tilted, and one flute slid, and in the half-second I had to make a decision, I lunged forward to catch it. I caught the glass. I did not, however, catch the small amount of champagne that had already escaped it, which arced in a clean, pale curve and landed directly on the sleeve of the black jacket belonging to the man at the center of the table. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The man who had caused it looked horrified. The others at the table went very still. I straightened immediately, the recovered glass clutched in both hands, my heart doing something frantic and uncoordinated behind my ribs. "I am so sorry," I said. The words came out steadier than I deserved. It was an accident. I'll get something to..." He turned to look at me. That was when I understood what destiny had meant. Not about the instruction to disappear, about something larger and harder to name, the reason the instruction existed at all. His eyes were dark, and when they found my face, they didn't move away. Most people, when caught in an awkward social moment, look away first. They reach for their phone, they glance at their companion, they give the flustered waitress an out. He did none of those things. He looked at me with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and he held it, and the weight of it was something I felt in my sternum. One of the men in the surrounding chairs began to speak. Korean, fast, and quiet. The man at the center raised one hand from the table. Just that. One hand, lifted slightly, and the voice stopped. He reached for the cloth napkin folded at his place setting and pressed it once against his sleeve. His eyes never left my face. "It's fine," he said. His English was precise, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place, each word deliberate. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to reach you. "I'm very sorry," I said again, because I didn't know what else to do. "I'll let the manager know and we'll..." I said it's fine, not unkind, not cruel, simply final, in the way of someone who was not accustomed to saying things more than once. I nodded. I collected my tray. I walked back toward the service corridor with measured steps, and only when the door swung shut behind me did I allow myself to press my back against the wall and close my eyes. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, or not only from fear. From something more complicated. The residue of a gaze that had lasted 3 seconds too long, that had catalogued something in me I hadn't offered, that had felt, in a way I couldn't justify or explain, like being recognized by someone who had no business knowing me at all. Destiny found me 30 seconds later. One look at my face and she pulled me further down the corridor. "What happened?" "I spilled champagne on him," I whispered. Her expression went through several stages in rapid succession. "On Harper. On him?" "His sleeve. It was barely anything. He said it was fine." "He spoke to you?" The way she said it. Not alarmed, exactly, but with a particular quality of attention that I didn't understand yet, should have been my first warning. I filed it away without understanding it, the way you set down something heavy before you've realized you've been carrying it too long. "It was an accident," I said. "I'll apologize to Calloway and..." "No." She grabbed my arm. "Don't say anything to Calloway. Don't make it a thing. Just finish the shift and go home." "Destiny." "Go home, Harper. Tonight." She released my arm and straightened her jacket. Some mistakes are better left small. She went back through the door. I stood in the corridor alone, the tray cold against my palms, the gold light from the dining room leaking in thin lines beneath the door. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know what he was. What kind of man sat at the center of a room and made everyone else in it hold their breath without raising his voice? I didn't know that in 72 hours I would see him again, and that this time I would not walk away. All I knew, standing in that narrow corridor with champagne still faintly damp on my fingers, was that something had shifted. The kind of shift you don't notice until the ground beneath you has already changed. I told myself it meant nothing. That's what I did for the next 2 days. I constructed a careful, reasonable version of events, in which a man had looked at me for slightly too long because I had spilled a drink on him, and that was the entire story. Beginning and end. People stare when you embarrass yourself. It doesn't mean anything. I poured his champagne on his jacket, and he was gracious enough not to make a scene. That was it. That was all. I almost believed it. The third morning after the dinner, I was running late. Not catastrophically late. 14 minutes, which at Alara translated to arriving exactly as the pre-service briefing ended, slipping into position behind the host stand while Calloway was still talking, and praying he hadn't taken attendance. I had overslept because my upstairs neighbor had decided midnight was the appropriate hour to rearrange furniture, and I had spent the first half of the night staring at the ceiling counting the sounds above my head instead of sleeping. I pushed through the side entrance of the restaurant, badge already in hand. My hair pulled back into something that looked intentional if you didn't examine it closely. The morning kitchen staff were moving through their routines, the scent of stock and roasted garlic already thickening the air near the prep stations. I nodded to Marco at the dish station, cut through the narrow hall past the linen storage, and came around the corner toward the host stand. I stopped. He was already there. Not at a table, not yet. He was standing near the entrance of the private dining room, speaking quietly to Calloway, who held a leather-bound reservation book against his chest like a shield. Two men flanked the entrance behind him, positioned with that particular stillness I now recognized from Tuesday night. A third stood near the front door, his gaze moving across the restaurant floor in slow, deliberate sweeps. Seokjin. I still didn't know his name. Wouldn't learn it until later. Wore a charcoal suit today, no tie. The collar of his shirt folded open at the throat, the same way it had been before. The tattoo climbed his neck like dark ivy, disappearing into his jaw. He had one hand in his jacket pocket, and he was listening to something Calloway said with an expression of polite, measured patience. Then he turned his head. Across the entire length of the restaurant floor, through the morning light coming in pale and gray through the front windows, across tables being set and chairs being straightened, he found me. Not by accident. Not the way a gaze wanders and happens to land somewhere. He turned his head with the particular precision of someone who already knew where to look. My feet stopped working entirely. Calloway followed his eyeline. I watched my manager's expression shift through something I couldn't fully interpret before he recovered his professional composure and gave me a tight, controlled nod. The universal managerial signal for come here and behave. I crossed the floor. My shoes were steady, even if the rest of me was not. Miss Harper. Calloway's voice carried the special texture he reserved for situations requiring damage control. Mr. Kwan has requested your section for this morning. I processed those words in the wrong order. Mr. Kwan has requested your section. My section, I repeated. Yes. Calloway's smile was the kind that didn't involve his eyes. Please see to it that the private room is prepared. Mr. Kwan's usual preferences have been communicated to the kitchen. I finally let myself look directly at the man standing 2 feet away. Up close, the details I'd only caught in fragments across a crowded room assembled themselves into something far more difficult to dismiss. The sharp geometry of his face, the almost unsettling steadiness of his gaze, dark eyes that held a quality of attention I associated with people who read situations the way others read text, thoroughly and without missing anything. He was younger than the authority around him suggested, and he was watching me the way someone watches a thing they've already decided to understand. Good morning, he said, the same precise low voice, accented, deliberate. Good morning, I managed. I'll have the room ready in a few minutes. He said nothing to that. He simply moved his gaze away, back to Calloway, back to the conversation, as if the exchange had concluded to his satisfaction. I walked toward the private room on legs that operated entirely on muscle memory, because my actual mind had temporarily relocated somewhere outside my body. I set the table. I adjusted the orchid arrangement. I aligned the silverware with the edge of the placemat and told myself, very firmly, that I was a professional, and this was a job, and there was nothing remarkable happening. He came in 10 minutes later. Alone, meaning without the other men from Tuesday's dinner, though one of his security detail took up a quiet position near the door, present but unobtrusive. He settled into the same chair he'd occupied 3 nights ago with the same unhurried certainty, and he picked up the menu even though I had the distinct sense he wasn't reading it. I poured his water. I recited the morning specials. I was precise and brief, and I did not make eye contact for longer than courtesy required. "You're not going to mention it," he said, when I'd finished. I paused. "Mention what, Mr. Kwan?" "The jacket." "There's nothing to mention. It was an accident and you were gracious about it." I kept my voice even. "Is there anything else I can tell you about the menu?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, too controlled for that, but an acknowledgement of something. "The sea bass," he said, "and coffee. Black." "Of course." I turned to leave. "Harper." I stopped. My own name in that voice landed differently than it should have. I turned back. "How long have you worked here?" A simple question. The kind that had no threatening architecture, no hidden floor. But he asked it with the particular quality of someone to whom small talk was not, in fact, small. Someone who gathered information the way others gathered pleasantries, and stored it with equal care. 7 months, I said. He nodded once, as if filing that away. "You're not from here originally." It wasn't a question. I had a slight accent of my own. Barely there. A leftover from the first 12 years of my life, spent in a smaller city 2 states south, smoothed nearly flat by years of deliberate erasure. The fact that he'd caught it in the space of 3 brief sentences told me something about the quality of his attention that I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "No," I said carefully. "Atlanta, originally." Another nod. He turned back to the menu, and I understood the conversation had ended because he'd chosen to end it, not because it had run out of things to say. I went to the kitchen and placed his order, and stood at the coffee station for a long moment, with both hands pressed flat against the counter, grounding myself in the cool solidity of the surface. Destiny appeared beside me. She had been watching the door of the private room, I realized, because she said nothing at first. Just looked at me with an expression caught somewhere between concern and something more complicated. "He asked for your section specifically," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Apparently. Harper." She lowered her voice further. "That man doesn't come back to the same place twice in a week. He doesn't request specific staff. He doesn't ask people where they're from." She picked up a tray and adjusted it. "I've worked here for 3 years, and I have seen people like him. Not often, but I've seen them, and they don't do things without reasons. Maybe he just liked the service." She looked at me with an expression that was almost kind in its directness. "That's not what this is." I carried his coffee in myself, set it down, asked if he needed anything else. He said no, without looking up from the window, where the gray morning was slowly brightening into something that looked almost like sun. I was nearly at the door when he spoke again. "You dropped the glass," he said, "but you caught it." I turned. He was still looking out the window. "On Tuesday," he continued, "you caught it before it hit the table. You were more concerned with the glass than with yourself." A pause. I noticed that. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. And somehow, in the silence between us, that felt like the most honest answer I could have offered. I returned to the floor. I finished my shift. I told myself the same reasonable, careful story I'd been telling myself for 3 days. But that evening, riding the subway home with my work bag across my lap, and the city sliding past the dark windows, I found myself thinking about the way he'd said I noticed that, not as a compliment, not as a flattery, but as a simple declaration of fact, as if noticing me had been something he'd simply done, thoroughly and without apology. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary chaos. Inside, something I hadn't named yet had already started to grow. His name was Seokjin Kwon. I learned it the way I learned most things about him. In fragments, through other people's careful silences. A whisper from Marco in the kitchen. A look exchanged between two of the senior waitstaff when his reservation appeared on the books for the third time in 10 days. A name spoken in the kind of hushed register that people reserve for things they respect and fear in equal measure. Seokjin Kwon, 31 years old, Korean-born, New York-based for the past 6 years. The kind of man whose name appeared nowhere you could easily search, but whose presence rearranged every room he entered. I didn't ask questions. I had learned, in the weeks since our first encounter, that asking questions about Seokjin Kwon was the kind of thing that made people look at you with sudden, concentrated concern. The way you'd look at someone who had just announced they intended to touch something dangerous. So I assembled what I could from the atmosphere around him and left the rest alone. What I knew for certain: he came to Alara every few days now, always the private room, always my section, always with at least one member of his security detail positioned near the entrance, sometimes two. He arrived in vehicles I never saw from the front windows, only heard occasionally the low sound of an engine idling at the private side entrance. He received phone calls he took by stepping briefly into the corridor, speaking in Korean too low to carry, and returning without explanation. Twice I had seen him receive a small folded note from one of his men mid-meal, read it without expression, and continue his coffee as if nothing had interrupted him. He was also, in the quietest and most unsettling way, the most attentive person I had ever served, not demonstratively. He didn't linger over conversation or manufacture reasons to speak to me, but he noticed things. The same way he had noticed me catching the glass, the way he had caught my accent in 3 sentences. He noticed when I was tired, which I was most mornings, and on those days he ordered efficiently and signaled for the check without making me circle back unnecessarily. He noticed when I'd changed the orchid arrangement in the private room, and said nothing about it, but glanced at it when he came in the way of someone cataloging a detail. Once, when a difficult table near the entrance had been openly dismissive toward me in a way that made my jaw tight, he had watched from across the room with an expression so still and so focused it had made the hairs on my arms stand up, and that particular table had quietly requested their check and left 20 minutes earlier than expected. I told myself I was imagining the connection between those two things. I was not imagining it. The morning everything changed had started as the most ordinary kind of difficult. I had received a call at 6 a.m. from my landlord informing me that the building's boiler had failed overnight, that there was no clear timeline for repair, and that I should make alternative arrangements. This, delivered in the tone of someone reading from a script, as though alternative arrangements were a thing I could produce from a drawer. I had showered at the gym 2 blocks from my apartment, with a bag I'd packed in the dark, arrived at work with damp hair I'd dried under the hand dryer in the employee restroom, and was operating on the particular brand of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of holding everything together when everything keeps testing the seams. Seokjin arrived at 9:15. He came in and settled into his chair, and I brought his coffee without being asked, because I knew by now. Black, no sugar, in the smaller of the 2 cup sizes we offered. He accepted it without comment. I recited the morning menu. He chose the same thing he always chose on Thursdays. I moved to leave. "Sit down," he said. I turned. "I'm sorry?" He was looking at me directly, with that quality of focused stillness that had stopped feeling startling, and started feeling in a way I didn't want to examine, like being steadied. "You've been standing since before I arrived. Sit down for a moment." "Mr. Kwon, I'm working. I'm aware." He pulled the chair across from him out slightly, just an inch, with 2 fingers. 1 minute. There was no reasonable argument to make against it that wouldn't have required a level of stubbornness. I simply didn't have the energy for that morning. I sat. The chair was absurdly comfortable in the way that expensive things often are, and the private room was warm, and for a moment I let the weight of the morning rest somewhere outside my body. He watched me without speaking. Not uncomfortably, just with that attention of his, the kind that made you feel examined without feeling exposed. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing. A minor housing inconvenience." "Boiler." I stared at him. "How did you— your hair?" The explanation was simple, delivered without emphasis. "You dried it in sections. The back is still slightly damp near the collar." His gaze moved briefly to the window. "The building on Archer, 2 blocks east. The super filed a maintenance report this morning." The stillness in my chest was the kind that follows a revelation you're not sure how to classify. "You know where I live." It wasn't an accusation. I didn't have the architecture for accusation right then. It came out more like a statement of fact, offered back to him for confirmation or correction. He didn't apologize. Seok-jin Kwan, I had come to understand, did not apologize for things he'd chosen to do. "I know a great many things about the people in my proximity," he said. "It isn't personal." And yet, something moved in his expression. "And yet," he agreed. I should have been alarmed. I processed the fact. Sitting in that warm private room with expensive coffee going cold between us, that a man who moved through the world the way he did had looked up my address and knew my building's maintenance schedule. And I cataloged the alarm carefully, set it aside to examine later, and sat very still in the chair he'd pulled out for me. "There's a residence above the Nakamura building on 5th, he said after a moment. "It belongs to someone I trust. It's empty until March. You could stay there while your building is repaired." I looked at him for a long time. "I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I don't—" I stopped, reorganized. "Because I don't know what accepting something like that means. From you." He considered this with the same gravity he gave everything. "It means you have somewhere warm to sleep," he said. "Nothing more complicated than that." "With respect, Mr. Kwan, everything around you is more complicated than that." The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile again, the one I'd started watching for without intending to. "Fair," he said. I stood, smoothed my apron, retrieved my professionalism from wherever it had briefly relocated. "I appreciate the offer. I'll manage." He let me go. He always let me go. That was the thing I noticed most about him. The detail that kept interrupting my careful, reasonable story. He never pressed. He never cornered. He simply made his positions known and then waited, with the patience of someone who understood that certain things could not be rushed without being ruined. But when I came back 20 minutes later to refill his coffee, there was a business card on the edge of the table. Plain matte black, a phone number, no name. He didn't reference it. He was reading something on his phone, his attention apparently elsewhere. I picked up the card. I told myself I was removing clutter from the table. I put it in my apron pocket. By that evening, sitting in my cold apartment with the space heater aimed at my feet and the boiler still silent in the basement 5 floors below, I turned the card over in my fingers for a long time. The number was printed in small silver type. Nothing else. I didn't call, but I didn't throw it away. 3 days later, when the building manager informed me the repair would take a minimum of 2 additional weeks, I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the November gray of the street below and thought about what Seok-jin had said. Nothing more complicated than that. I knew, with the particular clarity that comes from honesty you've been postponing, that this was not true. That there was no such thing, in the orbit of a man like him, as something uncomplicated. that accepting his offer would be the end of a particular kind of distance I had maintained with careful, deliberate effort for weeks. I also knew, standing at that window with cold air seeping under the frame and the card warm from my pocket in my hand, that the distance had already been closing for a long time. I was simply the last person to admit it. I typed the number into my phone. I held my finger over the call button. Outside, the first thin snow of the season had begun to fall, drifting down through the streetlight in pale, weightless silence. I pressed call. It rang once. I wondered, Seokjin said when he picked up, how long it would take. The apartment on 5th was nothing like anything I'd ever lived in. That sounds like an observation. It was closer to a collision, the kind that happens slowly. Over the course of the first morning, you wake up somewhere that belongs to a different category of life than the one you've known. The ceilings were high. The windows were floor-length and faced east, so the early light came in at an angle that turned the hardwood floors the color of warm honey. There was a kitchen with a gas range, an actual counter space, and a refrigerator that made ice without being asked. The bedroom closet was larger than my previous bathroom. I had brought 2 bags. They looked, sitting near the entrance, like items that had wandered into the wrong story. Seokjin had arranged everything through a single phone call the evening I'd reached out. By the following morning, a man named Daniel, quiet, efficient, offering no information beyond the practical, had met me at the building's entrance with a key card and a brief explanation of the unit's systems. No ceremony. No presence from Seokjin himself, which I had not known whether to feel relieved or strangely disappointed by. The answer, I discovered over the following days, was both. He texted the second morning. A single line. Everything functional? I responded that it was. He sent nothing further. I sat with my coffee at the long east-facing window and watched the city wake up below me, and told myself this arrangement was temporary and practical, and nothing I needed to assign meaning to. I assigned meaning to it anyway. He came to Alara 4 days after I moved in. Same chair, same coffee, same measured entrance with his security detail redistributing themselves around the room like water finding its level. I brought his order with the same professional composure I had cultivated over weeks of practice. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, direct, attentive, reading something in my expression that I wasn't consciously offering. "You slept," he said. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Kwan. It's not a criticism." The almost smile. "You look less like you're holding the world up with your back teeth." Despite myself, I laughed. It was brief and quiet, and it surprised me. The sound of it, the ease of it, in the middle of my carefully maintained composure. Something shifted in his expression when I did. Something that moved through his features quickly, and then was contained, the way a flame pulls back when the air changes. "Sit," he said. "I really shouldn't keep." "Harper." I sat. This had become, without any formal negotiation, the texture of our mornings. He ate. I brought things. And somewhere in the middle of it, he would say my name in that particular way. Not a command, not exactly, but a word with specific weight. And I would sit across from him in the chair he kept pulled out at a slight angle. And we would talk. Or rather, he would ask questions, and I would answer them. And occasionally I would ask something in return, and he would consider whether to answer with the visible care of a man accustomed to monitoring what he revealed. I learned things. Slowly, in the manner of someone who offers information the way they offer anything valuable, deliberately, and only after measuring the recipient. He had come to New York at 25. Before that, Seoul. And before that, a childhood he referenced only in the vaguest geographic terms, in the way of someone who had learned to carry the past lightly by carrying it alone. He spoke 4 languages. He read, not casually, but with the concentration of someone who treated books the way other people treated strategy sessions. He had a younger sister he mentioned once, briefly, in the context of a story about learning to cook, and then did not mention again. And something in the way he didn't mention her again told me more about the shape of his life than most things he'd said directly. What I understood, sitting across from him in that warm, private room over the weeks that November deepened into December, Seokjin Kwon had built himself a life in which he was entirely in control of every variable, every entrance, every exit, every person within arm's reach. The security that surrounded him was not vanity or performance. It was infrastructure, as functional and considered as any other system he maintained. He was not reckless. He was not cruel. He was a man who had learned, at some age I couldn't determine, that the world required managing, and had proceeded to manage it with complete, exhausting thoroughness. And then there was the way he managed me, which was to say, differently from everything else. It began subtly. A car that appeared at the end of my shifts on the nights I worked late. Not announced, never explained, simply there. A dark sedan with Daniel at the wheel, who nodded and opened the door without requiring conversation. A notification that the restaurant's night security had been updated, which Calloway mentioned with the slightly dazed expression of a man who hadn't requested the update and wasn't certain how to address that. Once, a morning when a man at the bar had been persistent and unpleasant in his attention toward me, I had looked up mid-shift to find Seok-jin standing near the private room entrance. He hadn't been expected that day. Watching the interaction with an expression so quiet and so absolute that the man at the bar had become suddenly, inexplicably interested in settling his check. "You don't need to do that," I told him afterward in the corridor. "Do what?" The picture of innocence, which on him was almost amusing. Whatever that was. He looked at me steadily. "He was making you uncomfortable. I can handle uncomfortable. I know you can." A pause. I chose to handle it differently. There was something in that phrasing. I chose that I turned over later in the quiet of the Fifth Avenue apartment, lying in the dark with the city's distant sounds below me. The distinction between I had to and I chose to was, I was learning, the center of how Seok-jin operated. Everything he did was a decision. Nothing was accidental, which meant every small, quiet act of protection had been weighed and selected and directed specifically at me, and the awareness of that was doing something to the careful, reasonable story I kept trying to tell myself. December arrived with sharp cold and early darkness. The apartment's heating was perfect, which I found excessive and then became grateful for. I had extended my stay without discussion. The topic of when I would return to my own building had simply not arisen, and I had not raised it, and Seok-jin had not raised it, and that mutual silence felt like its own kind of conversation. One evening, 2 weeks into December, I came home from a closing shift to find a small package on the kitchen counter. A key card, a new one, with a note in handwriting I recognized as Seok-jin's. Spare and precise, the letters controlled. Building updated security. This replaces the previous card. S. Not Mr. Kwon, not a full name. S. I held the note for longer than I needed to. The following morning at Alara, I arrived to find the private room already occupied. Seok-jin was there, early, which was unusual, and he was not alone. A woman sat across from him, elegantly dressed, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the composed bearing of someone accustomed to rooms like this. She was speaking when I entered, and both of them looked up. "I'll come back," I said immediately. "Stay," Seok-jin said. The woman's eyes moved to me with the particular quality of assessment that has nothing to do with rudeness. A clean, thorough evaluation, the kind professionals give each other. Then she looked back at Seok-jin, and something passed between them that I couldn't read. "This is Harper," he said. To her, in a tone I had never heard him use. Not softer exactly, but different. Carrying something. The woman's expression shifted by a degree so small I almost missed it. "I see," she said. She left 20 minutes later. I served the table, said nothing about the exchange, and was nearly out the door when he spoke. She asked me something, Seokjin said, without preamble. He was looking at the window, his coffee untouched. A personal question. About whether there was someone. A pause. I told her the truth. The room was very quiet. Which was? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to understand that the answer was the thing I had been circling for 2 months, the gravity at the center of all those careful orbits. He turned from the window and looked at me, and in his expression, for the first time since I'd known him, the control was not entirely there. Something had gotten through it, or been permitted through it, which with Seokjin amounted to the same thing. That I'd been loving someone else this whole time, he said, without having the right to. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. My heart was doing something large and poorly organized behind my ribs. Seokjin. I know what I am, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm not asking you for anything. He turned back to the window. I just didn't want to lie to her, or to you, by omission. I stood in the doorway of that warm, private room with the December light coming in gray and thin through the glass, and I thought about cages, how some of them are made of iron, and some of them are made of something far more difficult to name, and how you don't always notice you've walked into one until you realize you've stopped looking for the door. What I'm about to say, I began, and my voice came out steadier than my hands, is probably not the sensible thing. He waited. That was what he did. He waited. I think, I said carefully, that I've been loving someone I didn't have the right to either. The city moved below us, indifferent and vast, and in the private room at the center of Alara, something that had been building since a spilled glass and a 3-second gaze finally arrived at the surface, quiet and irreversible. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood, crossed the room, and stopped close enough that I could see the careful architecture of his expression, holding against something considerable. That's the most frightening thing anyone has ever said to me, he told me. Good, I said. Now you know how I've felt for 2 months. And for the first time, completely and without calculation, Seokjin Kwon smiled. The world didn't stop because 2 people told each other the truth. That's something they don't prepare you for. How ordinary the hours are, immediately after something enormous. How the city outside continues its noise. How your shift starts at the same time. How the coffee still needs pouring and the silverware still needs aligning and life arranges itself around a changed thing without acknowledging that the change occurred at all. What shifted, in the days after that morning, was quieter than I'd expected, and more complete. Seokjin didn't become someone different. He didn't suddenly speak more, or move through the world with less caution, or abandon the layered, considered way he operated. He was still the man who arrived in vehicles I never saw from the street, still the man whose phone held conversations I was not part of, still the man around whom rooms rearranged themselves without his asking. The security detail remained. The careful management of entrances and exits remained. The particular stillness that preceded his decisions. All of it remained, exactly as it had been. But something in how he directed that attention had shifted its center of gravity. Toward me. He told me things. Not everything. I understood there were rooms inside him I would not be invited into. Walls that existed for reasons older and more serious than our 2 months of careful circling. But he told me things he chose to tell me, which with Seokjin was its own significant category. He told me about his sister, Jisoo, who lived in Vancouver now, and called him every Sunday, and was the only person in the world who spoke to him without any awareness of what he was. He told me about arriving in New York with 2 contacts and a reputation he'd spent years building into something impenetrable. He told me, One evening in the apartment on 5th with snow pressing softly against the windows, that he had not allowed himself to want something ordinary, something personal, something that belonged only to him, in a very long time. "Why now?" I asked. He looked at me across the kitchen table, where we had somehow ended up sharing a meal I'd cooked, and he'd watched me cook with the focused interest of someone studying a new system. "Because you caught the glass," he said, "and then you apologized for the champagne instead of for the inconvenience to yourself." A pause. "I've spent a long time in rooms full of people who calculate everything. You didn't calculate. It was," he considered the word, "disarming. I spilled a drink on you." "You caught the glass first," he said. "That's the part that mattered." I understood, hearing him say it, that this was how Seokjin loved. In the details, in the noticed things, in the small distinctions that other people's attention moved past without registering. It was not a simple love. It was not the kind that arrived with ease or announced itself plainly. It was the love of a man who had learned that most things worth having required sustained, careful attention, and who had turned that attention, wholly and without apology, toward me. It was also, I will not pretend otherwise, the love of a man whose world carried weight I could not fully see. I knew this. I held it alongside everything else, the way you hold something true that is also complicated, and I made my choice with both eyes open. January came. The boiler in my building was repaired. I did not move back. Neither of us discussed it. I simply stayed, and he simply continued to exist in the orbit of that apartment with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided and saw no reason to revisit the decision. My 2 bags had become a closet's worth of things. His handwriting was on a notepad on the kitchen counter, his second phone charged on the table near the door. We had built, without blueprints, something that looked remarkably like a life shared. There were difficulties. I will not construct a version of this story where there weren't. There was an evening in late January when I came home to find 3 men I didn't recognize in the building lobby, dismissed efficiently by Daniel before I reached the elevator, and Seokjin spent that night in phone calls he took in the study with the door closed, emerging at 2 a.m. to find me still awake on the couch. He sat beside me without explanation, and I didn't ask for one. I put my head on his shoulder and he rested his hand over mine, and we stayed that way until the city outside went quiet. "Is it handled?" I asked eventually. "Yes." "Will it happen again?" A long pause. Honest. "Something will always happen again. That is the nature of what I am." He looked at the dark window. "I can't change the world I come from. I can only be careful about what I bring near you." "I'm not asking you to change it," I said. "I'm asking you to be honest with me." He turned his head and looked at me. In the low light of the apartment, with the city quiet outside and the warmth between us, his expression held something I had not seen before in all our careful months, something unguarded, almost startled, as though honesty of that particular kind was not something he'd been offered before and wasn't entirely sure how to receive. "I'll be honest with you," he said, "about everything I can be honest about." "That's enough," I told him, and I meant it. Spring arrived the way it does in New York, grudgingly in fits, cold one morning and almost warm the next. I was still at Alara. I had, without entirely planning to, become the kind of employee Calloway treated with a new and slightly bewildered respect. A respect I understood had less to do with my service record and more to do with the man who reserved the private room with my section specifically, every time, without exception. I found I didn't mind. I had stopped apologizing for taking up space. One Sunday morning in March, Seokjin's phone rang during breakfast, the personal one, which almost never rang. He looked at the screen, and something in his face shifted in the particular way it shifted for only one person. "Take it," I said. He answered. Korean, warm and slightly different in register than any tone I'd heard from him before. Lighter, easier, the voice of a man who was also a brother. I washed dishes and listened to the cadence of it without understanding the words, and felt something settle in my chest. After several minutes, he held the phone out toward me. I looked at him. "She wants to say hello," he said. His expression was careful in a new way, the carefulness of someone who has offered something significant and is watching to see how it's received. I dried my hands. I took the phone. "Hello?" A woman's voice, warm and direct and carrying the same precise quality as her brother's. "So you're the one who spilled champagne on my brother's favorite jacket." I looked at Seokjin, who was watching me with his arms crossed and something deeply human and slightly vulnerable in his expression. "He told you about that?" I said. "He tells me very little," Jisoo said, "which is how I knew it was important." I laughed. And across the kitchen, watching me with the focused, quiet attention that had started everything, Seokjin Kwon smiled, full and unhurried and entirely real, the way I had come to understand he only smiled when he wasn't thinking about it. We stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, Jisoo and I. She was funny and sharp, and asked me questions that were actually about her brother, framed sideways with the skill of someone who had spent years learning to read what he wouldn't say directly. I answered honestly. When I handed the phone back, Seokjin spoke to her briefly in Korean, and then set the phone down, and looked at me across the kitchen with an expression I had no single word for. "She likes you," he said. "I like her." He nodded once. Then he crossed the kitchen, stood beside me at the counter, and in the ordinary Sunday morning light of the apartment on 5th, dishes in the drying rack, coffee going warm in the pot, snow long gone and the first pale suggestion of spring arriving through the east-facing windows, he took my hand. Not dramatically, not with declaration or ceremony, just his hand around mine, deliberate and steady, the way he did everything. "I want to show you something," he said. He took me that afternoon to a building on the Lower West Side, not the kind of building that appeared in any public record, tucked at the end of a block, behind a wrought iron gate that his key opened without hesitation. Through a courtyard, up a back stairwell, to a rooftop that opened suddenly onto the whole unguarded skyline of the city. No surveillance, no security, no phones, just wind and gray-blue sky, and the city spread in every direction without apology. I turned in a slow circle, taking all of it in. "No one knows about this place," he said beside me. "No one has ever—" He paused, in the manner of a man reorganizing what he had been about to say. "I come here when I need to remember that things can be uncomplicated." I looked at him. He was already looking at me. "I brought you here," he said, "because I want you to understand something. Everything in my world has weight. Every decision, every room, every person. There is always something it costs." He turned toward the skyline. "This is the only place I have ever been able to stand and feel that the cost is manageable, that the world is—" A pause. "Bearable." He looked back at me. "You do the same thing," he said quietly. "You make it bearable." The wind moved between us, cool and clean. The city stretched in every direction, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unaware of the two of us standing at its edge with something fragile and decided and true. I stepped toward him. He didn't move. He never moved first, I had come to understand, because moving first was a vulnerability he had spent years protecting against. So I moved first, and I reached up and took his face in both hands, and I looked at him the way he had been looking at me since a Tuesday night, and a spilled glass, and a silence in a corridor. "You make it bearable too," I told him. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Long enough to receive that, to let it land somewhere real. Then he opened them, and he was looking at me with all the careful architecture of his expression finally, completely set aside. He pressed a brief, quiet kiss to my forehead. His hands came to rest at my shoulders, warm and solid and present. We stood like that for a long time, above the city, in the only uncomplicated place he had ever found. I thought about cages. About the golden kind, the ones you don't notice until you realize you've stopped looking for the door. I had walked into the orbit of a man who could have made the walls invisible, who had every means and possibly every instinct to close the distance without asking. He had never closed anything without asking. The cage, I understood now, had never been his. Every door had been left open. Every choice had been returned to me, again and again, with the patience of a man who understood that the only thing worth having is what is freely given. I had chosen to stay. Not because I had no other door, not because the world outside was too large or too cold, but because standing here, in the one uncomplicated place in a complicated life, with his hands at my shoulders and the city below us and all of it, the weight, the difficulty, the rooms I would never see, the phone calls in the night, the life he carried that I had accepted without illusion. All of it mine now, along with the good of him. The skyline held its light, and it was enough. It was at last more than enough.